Bamboo feces traps were worse than death. What US soldiers faced in Vietnam. They weren't just fighting bullets, they were fighting the jungle itself. Bamboo spikes, sharpened by hand, coated in human feces, and buried beneath leaves. These weren't traps meant to kill, they were built to maim, to infect, to leave a man screaming for hours while his buddies tried to save him, and sometimes got caught themselves. US soldiers in Vietnam called them Punji pits, but what they really were nightmares waiting to happen. The Viet Cong didn't need tanks or air power, they had patience, and they had the jungle. This isn't just the story of hidden weapons. It's a story of slow, deliberate pain, engineered to break the body and mind. Subscribe now, because what you're about to hear is the most disturbing weapon in Vietnam, and the most forgotten. When American boots first touched Vietnamese soil, the assumption was clear. This would be a war won by superior firepower, technology, and brute strength. But what the US military didn't realize, at least not at first, was that they had entered a battlefield designed to fight back in ways no rifle could prepare them for. The enemy wasn't always a soldier. Sometimes it was the ground beneath your feet. The Viet Cong were outgunned, outfinanced, and outnumbered, but they had one thing the US forces didn't: an intimate relationship with the terrain. They knew every trail, every clearing, every water buffalo path that Americans might use, and so they weaponized the jungle with bamboo. Bamboo grew quickly, was readily available, and could be honed into razor-sharp spikes, tougher than metal. But the cruelty didn't stop there. These spikes were often dipped in human or animal feces, turning them into tools of infection as much as instruments of pain. It was biological warfare without needing chemicals. A soldier who fell into a pit didn't just risk being pierced, he risked his wounds turning septic, rotting, and spreading gangrene within hours. Sometimes, amputation wasn't just a treatment, it was the only option left. Windshield were called Punji pits, dug knee-deep or deeper, lined with stakes, angled to tear through boots and flesh alike. Some had lids that collapsed under a soldier's weight. Others were hidden under grass, mud, even corpses. Soldiers often had no idea they'd stepped into one until they were screaming, bleeding, and unable to move. But that was the intention. The traps weren't designed to kill, they were designed to wound. A dead soldier is carried out in silence. A wounded one cries, panics, and forces others to stop everything to save him. It paralyzes a unit. It breaks momentum. And in a war where the enemy disappeared into the trees, that delay could be fatal. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than a hole in the ground. But that hole was a carefully constructed ambush, often just deep enough to catch a leg, yet deadly enough to change a man forever. Inside were rows of sharpened bamboo stakes, often angled backward so that if you tried to pull your leg out, the stakes would dig deeper, ripping muscle and tissue like meat off a bone. Some pits were designed to twist the leg as it sank, causing tendons to snap and bones to shatter. Others featured stakes spaced just right to impale the calf or thigh but avoid major arteries, ensuring the victim stayed alive long enough to scream, writhe, and spread panic. But the horror didn't stop at impalement. The tips of these stakes were frequently smeared with human feces, animal dung, or rotting meat. This wasn't some improvised trick. It was intentional, tactical, and disturbingly effective. Soldiers who survived the initial wound almost always developed severe infections. Within hours, the area around the wound would swell, darken, and ooze pus. In some cases, maggots set in. Field medics had limited options. If antibiotics didn't stop the rot, the limb had to go. And that was the real weapon. Not the spike itself, but the slow decay it unleashed. For every man pulled out of a Punji pit, 2 or 3 more were needed to carry him, treat him, or call for medevac. The trap removed one soldier from the fight and tied up several more. Protection: some pits were disguised beneath shallow water, others hidden with woven mats, dead leaves, or even civilian clothing, creating a false sense of safety. There were reports of entire patrols halted because one man fell in and couldn't be retrieved without triggering more traps. It wasn't just pain, it was paralysis. A hole in the earth turned into a black hole in the battlefield. And for the men who saw what happened inside one, the jungle was never the same again. Punji pits were just the beginning. As US forces adapted, so did the Viet Cong. The traps evolved, grew more creative, more unpredictable, and infinitely more disturbing. No longer confined to the ground, the next generation of jungle warfare came swinging from the trees. These were the hinged death traps, mechanical nightmares built from bamboo, rope, spikes, and a ruthless understanding of how fear works. One of the most notorious was the swing trap, sometimes called a Venus flytrap. Picture a door-sized slab of bamboo, rigged with rusty nails, metal spikes, or sharpened stakes, each one coated in excrement or poison. It was suspended in the jungle canopy, held in place by a thin tripwire or trigger stick. A single touch, a brush of a boot or rifle, and the panel would swing down with gravity's full weight, slamming straight into a soldier's torso, neck, or face. Flattened, these traps didn't always kill outright. They crushed ribs. They impaled lungs. They took out eyes. Strike low, shattering knees and thighs. They turned patrols into rescue missions and filled the jungle air with the screams of men who never saw it coming. And then came the whipping bombs, spring-loaded branches or metal rods packed with shrapnel or spikes. These were often buried in brush or disguised as part of the landscape. When triggered, they snapped upward with blinding speed, striking legs and groins like a snake made of steel. One Marine described seeing a man hit so hard in the knee that the bone folded like a tent pole. The Viet Cong didn't need large-scale firepower. They needed only time, bamboo, and knowledge of where a soldier would step. These traps were silent until they weren't, fast until it was too late. Flooding every rustle in the brush, every vine across a path became a question of survival. Do I step over it? Do I cut it? Do I move at all? In Vietnam, hesitation could save your life. Movement could take it. And the jungle always had the final word. These traps weren't just physical weapons, they were psychological warfare at its purest form. Every swing trap, every Punji pit, every hidden spike wasn't just meant to wound the body, it was meant to infect the mind, to make every American soldier question the dirt under their boots, to destroy their confidence in the very ground they walked on. And over time, it worked. In the thick of Vietnam's jungle, paranoia became a constant companion. US soldiers stopped looking at the tree line for enemies and started staring at the earth like it might bite them. Each step forward was a gamble, a sick, silent lottery where the prize could be a spike in the shin or an infection that cost you your leg. And worse, these weren't just accidents, they were deliberate. Someone had carved those bamboo tips, someone had smeared them with filth, someone wanted you to suffer. Commanding officers began to notice a shift in their men. Soldiers hesitated before entering clearings. Point men, the ones assigned to lead patrols, started rotating more frequently because the role was mentally exhausting. Walking out front meant being the first to fall, the first to bleed, and sometimes the last to come back. Naked were traps designed to target rescuers, tripwires connected to secondary traps, mines placed alongside Punji pits, so that if you tried to help a fallen comrade, you triggered another explosion. The Viet Cong weren't just trying to injure one man, they were trying to tear apart entire squads from the inside out. A basho. And as each unit took losses from traps rather than firefights, the fear began to outpace the enemy. It became something deeper, something darker. The jungle was no longer a place, it was a living force. It didn't just hide the Viet Cong, it was the Viet Cong. By 1968, some US troops admitted they were more afraid of the forest floor than enemy bullets, and that fear never left them. Didn't end when they were pulled from the pit or cut down from the brush. In many cases, that was only the beginning. The wounds inflicted by bamboo stakes and spike swing traps weren't clean. They were jagged, filthy, and deliberately contaminated. Infection set in fast, and when it did, it wasn't just painful, it was catastrophic. Doctors and medics in field hospitals began noticing the same pattern. Soldiers would arrive with puncture wounds that looked manageable, deep, but not immediately fatal. But within hours, the surrounding flesh would begin to swell. Then it would blacken, then rot. The smell was unmistakable, a mix of decay, sweat, and something sickeningly sweet. Gangrene, tetanus, sepsis. In a war zone where antibiotics were limited and surgery was performed in tents, the solution was often brutal: amputation. Legs, arms, feet, gone. Not from gunfire, not from explosions, from bamboo, from human waste, from a sharpened stick buried in the jungle mud. Some soldiers begged for it, others fought it, but the truth was harsh. If the limb wasn't removed, the infection would spread to the bloodstream. Once that happened, the odds of survival dropped sharply, and so young men, barely old enough to drink, were put under anesthesia and woke up missing half of themselves. The psychological toll was immense. They came to Vietnam to serve, to fight, to return home proud. Instead, many returned home broken, their bodies altered by a war that never even gave them a chance to fire their weapon. Lahoma, Augs were the lucky ones. Some never made it out of the jungle, their bodies too wounded to carry, were left behind or buried quickly before more traps could claim another victim. Their names were added to lists, their dog tags sent home in silence. The jungle didn't need to shoot you to kill you. Sometimes, all it had to do was wait. As if Punji pits and swing traps weren't cruel enough, the Viet Cong developed something even more sinister, something that preyed not just on flesh, but on compassion. These were known among US troops as bait traps, or booby-trapped bodies, and they represented one of the darkest tactics of the entire war. The method was chillingly simple. A dead body, sometimes a fellow Viet Cong fighter, sometimes even a fallen American, would be placed in plain view along a trail or at the edge of a rice paddy. It looked like an opportunity to retrieve a comrade, gather intelligence, or even offer mercy, but the body was rigged. Underneath it, or even sewn into it, were grenades, tripwires, or pressure-activated charges. Windshield knelt to help. The bomb went off. And entire squads were wiped out this way, because their instinct to protect one another had been weaponized against them, and the Viet Cong knew exactly what they were doing. It wasn't just about killing, it was about breaking trust. Further, seemingly abandoned crates of ammo were left behind during retreats. Helmets were placed perfectly along paths. Even children's toys were sometimes wired to explode. One infamous tactic involved rigging an American soldier's own rucksack, stolen earlier, to detonate when lifted. The point was always the same. No moment of safety was real. No gesture of kindness went unpunished. The jungle taught US soldiers that danger could come disguised as a friend, a fallen ally, or a second chance. After a while, even acts of rescue became calculated risks. Soldiers used sticks to roll over corpses. They prodded every object before touching it, and still sometimes it wasn't enough. In Vietnam, it wasn't just the enemy you had to watch, it was everything. Because even the dead weren't always done fighting. For many who survived the traps of Vietnam, the war never really ended. They made it home with their lives, but not with peace. Some had scars that ran deep into the flesh, twisted limbs, or missing parts of their bodies. Others looked fine on the outside, but were haunted inside by memories that refused to fade. The bamboo spikes had done more than pierce skin. They had burrowed into the psyche. Veterans would later speak of nightmares, where they were falling endlessly into pits. Reliving the moment the ground gave way beneath them, the sharp crack of a twig could trigger a full-body panic. Some avoided wooded areas for the rest of their lives. Others couldn't bring themselves to step off a sidewalk into grass. The jungle had taught them not to trust the earth, and that lesson stayed forever. Many suffered from what would eventually be known as PTSD, though at the time, it had no name. Soldiers were told to toughen up, move on, forget. But you can't forget the smell of rotting wounds, or the sound of your friends screaming after stepping into a trap you missed. Some turned to alcohol or drugs, others to isolation. A few never spoke of the war again, even to their families. One veteran, when asked what scared him most during his tour, didn't mention firefights, mortars, or snipers. He simply said, "The silence," because that's when the traps got you. Even decades later, veterans limped through airports on prosthetic limbs and carried a pain few could understand. Not because they lost a leg, but because of how they lost it. Because it wasn't a noble battle. It wasn't in the heat of combat. It was a hidden pit, a sharpened stick, human waste smeared on bamboo in a hole disguised by jungle leaves, fiberglass. It felt personal. It felt humiliating. It felt like betrayal by the land itself. Pinch. And for thousands of soldiers, that betrayal still echoes in their bones. Today, Punji pits and bamboo feces traps are often relegated to a footnote in history books, a gruesome curiosity from a controversial war. But for the men who faced them, front lines, no safety, and no rules. In Vietnam, even the earth turned against you. Even silence could kill. These traps weren't mass-produced in factories. They were handcrafted, patiently, cruelly, by people who knew they couldn't win a war through firepower. So instead, they fought through fear. They weaponized time, terrain, and terror. And in doing so, they created a legacy that still echoes in the minds of the men who survived. Today, replicas of these traps are shown in Vietnamese museums. Tour guides demonstrate how they worked. Tourists wince at the sharp bamboo, and then they move on. But for veterans, there's no moving on. A Punji pit wasn't just a weapon, it was a message. You don't belong here. You will bleed here, and you will remember. And they do remember. The scars remain, some visible, others buried deep. For every soldier who returned home missing a limb, there are others who returned missing something they couldn't name, a sense of safety, trust in the world, the ability to close their eyes without seeing the jungle that can't be buried. The truth about what they endured, the truth about a war that turned bamboo into a symbol of cruelty, and the truth that for many, stepping on one trap didn't just change the course of the war, it changed the course of their entire lives. So the next time you hear about the Vietnam War, don't just think of helicopters, rice paddies, or protest signs. Think of the hidden pain, the slow, creeping infection, the quiet step that became a scream. Homeland, because sometimes it wasn't the bullet that broke a man, it was the jungle, and it never let him go.